Well, welcome to today's session. My primary focus for today would be to expand on a few concepts that we started in the prior session, and specifically, I'm referring to valuation concepts. So we are still on the valuation theme, and I gave a definition of valuation in the prior session, and I provided some examples. Just to, I guess, summarize, I mentioned that there are several ways of carrying out a valuation of an asset, whether that be a property, um, a company, the equity of a public company, the debt, or the debt securities of a company. There's several ways. One way is to do what we call intrinsic valuation. And this is usually carried out by a process called a discounted cash flow method. You can also value a company using an accounting method. The second approach is what I call the relative pricing. And I gave you two. One was the replacement cost analysis, and the second was what I call the comparable sales analysis. And in today's session, I'm going to briefly speak on these three valuation methods. But let me begin with the discounted cash flow method. It's called the DCF, discounted cash flow method. In its very simple form, what you're trying to do, if you're going to use this method, is you're trying to understand the property's ability to generate cash flow during the period of ownership of the property or the real estate. And because cash flow is produced over a period of time, sometimes the cash flow comes in every month, some other times it comes in every quarter, every 6 months, or every year. It all depends on the arrangement that has been agreed between the owner and those who are either renting or leasing your property. But in any case, what we try to do, let me not say you, let's say we, let me include myself in that conversation. What we try to do is I try to, specifically myself now, ascertain what the present value of all the cash flow that the property will produce. So the first thing to do is begin with what I call a timeline. A timeline. And let's just say these are points representing years on this timeline. And here what we have is a 5-year period. I'll put this as the start, which is 0. Let's assume that this is the date upon which the property is purchased and upon which the property is in your ownership. And let me just assume, just for the case, for the sake of this conversation, that you're able to have this property leased in period 0. In this example, I'd like you to consider, I guess, the concept first before I give you a formula. But the concept is that after the first year, the property produces a certain amount of cash flow. Let's assume this is £100. £100, £100, £100, £100. Over the 5-year period, let's assume the property will produce £500 of free cash flow. because the person who is renting the property is not giving you the property and it's cash, it's not giving you the rental income all in one go, what we have to do is we have to discount the first £100 back to the starting point, the second to the starting point, the third to the starting point, the fourth to the starting point, and the fifth to the starting point. It's really that simple. Reason being, like I explained, £100 in a year's time does not have the same purchasing power as £100 today, and certainly £100 in 2 years' time does not have the same purchasing power as it does today. So what we are trying to do is effectively understand what the present value. Whenever you see me use the word present value, this is synonymous with discounted value. The present value is the same as the discounted value. So DCF is the discounted cash flow. That's all it means. What that means is that a formula for estimating what the cash flow would be for the property is simply you take the cash flow for the first year and then you discount year one, cash flow second year, and you discount 2, cash flow third year, and you discount 3, 4, and you discount, and then finally cash flow and you discount. Now in principle, let's assume that in this case this property was bought for 100,000, and at the end of the 5th year you intend to sell the property. Let's assume that the property will be worth 120,000. Bless me. Oh. I'm sorry about that. We've got to go on. I'm sorry. I have to apologize because I don't edit my videos. I just keep them rolling. So apologies for the sneeze, and I'll move on. In any case, if the property will be worth 120,000 at the end of the 5th year and you intend to sell the property, in order to estimate what the property's value is, you would discount all of the cash flow every year. But at the end of the final year, you will have £120,000, which would be the price you obtain from the sale of the property. That price also has to be discounted back as well. So you would discount the 120 also back to the present. Obviously, when you sell the property for £120,000, one of the things you would have to do will be to take into account all of the costs for the sale, because the cash flow you're obtaining here is a net value. This is the cash flow, free cash flow, after you've made all the reinvestments, after you've made all the cost expenditure for any improvements the property needs. And therefore what you're getting from these cash flows are the net amounts. The 120 will be the price you sell the property for, but that does not include the costs you would incur for the sale. But for the purpose of this conversation, let's just assume that what you get is £120,000. Let's just assume that. You discount that back. So when you get to number 5, you would also have the final, which is 120,000 divided by 1/5. This process that I've gone through is how you can imagine the formula to look like. Therefore, the DCF formula is a simple one. Your cash flow in your first year, 1 plus R raised to the power 1, plus cash flow second year, 1 plus R raised to the power 2, and then you continue until CF cash flow N, 1 plus R raised to the power N. Let me perhaps expand on something. In this example, we are assuming that the property will be sold after 5 years. If the property will be held beyond the 5th year, and if it will be held for a much longer time, there is an approach to use so that you're not having to guess what the property will sell for. The best approach will be to estimate what the cash flow the property will produce in perpetuity. I'll come to that in the subsequent sessions. But let me come back to this definition. This is cash flow. R is your discount rate, which is the same as your cost of capital, which is the same as your interest rate, which is the same as your hurdle rate. Again, I'm simplifying. I am simplifying because in principle, each of these items, although I use them synonymously, they can represent, they can be used to represent other terms under different scenarios. So, but for the purpose of discounting, whenever I use discount rate or cost of capital, or your interest rate or your hurdle rate, I'm referring to the same thing. If you carry out this process correctly, what you find is that the value of the property using the DCF approach really focuses on the fundamentals of the property. You're not speculating. I know I made reference to this amount here, but this was just a way of just drawing your attention to the fact that at the end of the 5-year period, you will have some money, much more than the cash flow. But if you were doing the intrinsic value the right way, one of the things you would never do is assume what the property would be sold for. I'll show you how to estimate this directly. But for the purpose of this conversation today, I think it serves its course. Again, using this formula means that you're looking at the fundamentals of the property, and therefore, unlike this £120,000, you're not subject to the behavior of the market. Because some people would say, I bought the property for £100,000. I'm going to assume the price will go up by 4% every year, and in the 5th year, I should have a much more valuable property. If you apply that approach, you're dependent on what happens in the market, whether the market is high, whether the market is low in its cycle. Whereas if you follow the original discounted cash flow method without using any form of pricing projection, what you would find is that you are immunized from whatever the market does, especially in the short term. So this approach to valuation has a protective mechanism built into it. It keeps the investor protected against market mood and market momentum. That does not mean that this approach is foolproof, and that does not mean it doesn't have its own disadvantages. It does. It does. However, by using the fundamentals of the property, the error that you would make, the probability of error is minimized, is reduced. Obviously, one of the disadvantages or downsides to the DCF approach is that you're making, and I am making, very explicit assumptions when I do my analysis. So, for example, at the point you're trying to buy the property, you may not have had the property leased, and therefore you're projecting that the income will be rather the cash flow will be £100 annually. That is an assumption. That is an estimate. But I'm making this estimate explicit, which means I'm subject to error or I'm subject to changes. It's possible that in the 5th year, this could actually be 150, or it could be 97. In the 2nd year, this could be 110, or it could be 85. This means that there is a range of estimates, that a range of probabilities with regards to my analysis. Therefore, the accuracy and the quality of your analysis when you use the DCF approach usually hinges on how conservative you are in your assumptions. In my opinion, this is the best approach for analyzing properties, the intrinsic value using a DCF approach. Now, I should say something. If you use this methodology, one of the things you would find is that most of the time, the market tends to be overvalued and overpriced. Now, let me say that again. If you use the DCF approach to valuing properties, one of the things you would find is that the market usually is overpriced and overvalued. Think about this as a pendulum swinging from one extreme to the other. Market participants are always making decisions, and usually the intrinsic value is a rational estimate of the property's value. This is the reason why, if you were to go back to 2007, January, in London, you could have found a 2-bedroom that was on the market for, say, £300,000. No, say £450,000. And by 2009, January, the same property was selling for £225,000. Same property. And the question is, in that time period, surely the property value could not have dropped by 50%. Something happened, the mood, the momentum in the market changed. The market became pessimistic, and therefore the market repriced all assets. The point I'm making by this is, using the DCF approach is meant to be for investors that have a long time horizon, who are not fazed by a need to always invest. Because it's slightly more rational, conservative, and prudent, what you would find is that most of the time, the market seems overpriced. The second thing I would mention is the DCF approach is best for properties that have the ability to generate cash flow. Properties such as land that does not generate free cash flow, you should not be using the DCF approach. So if you have a piece of land and it's forest land, then you can estimate the amount of trees that can be felled, and then you can estimate the amount of timber you would grow, and then you can translate that to a cash flow. If you have a land that you lease out and is used for cows and sheep, then you could also estimate the amount of biological assets that you can grow on the land, and you can translate that to a monetary value. But if you have a barren piece of land, uncultivated, unused, no cash flow, then you should not be using this approach. Another thing, though, I should say, is that this approach to valuation should be used by investors. Now, keep this in mind very carefully. It should be used by investors who have, one, you have a long time horizon, and you can be patient. You can be patient for the market to correct any mistake the market has made. The market swings from one extreme to the other. Most of the time, the market seems to be overvalued. Every now and then, the market swings back to being undervalued. And what you're trying to do is wait for the best time. Now, the market does not have to swing all the way back here for the property to be worth a purchase. You just have to ensure the intrinsic value exceeds the total purchase cost. Number two is that it's best for investors who are not really swayed by peer pressure, or people who are influenced by what we call group think. And number three, this is best for investors who can be the catalyst that they need. Here is the key thing. Who can be the catalyst to cause the property's price to move to its true value? A good example. You find a property, it's somewhat run down, but you can see through the derelict nature of the property. You bought the property for 500,000. You intend to spend £100,000, but you know, because you're quite detailed in your approach, you know that once you've converted the property and renovated the property, the true value of the property would be about £750,000, which would mean that there's a trap value of £150,000 net. But right now, the market says the property is worth 500. You believe the property is worth 750, providing you spend 100,000 on the property. And if you are correct, you stand to make £150,000. So, going back to point number 3, in order for the property's price to move from 500 to 750, the property needs a catalyst. The property needs a developer, someone willing to take on the responsibility of moving things around so that the market can then see the property's true worth. We call that a catalyst. So the third part is this methodology is useful for people who can become the catalyst, such as when you are a developer or when you bought a property like I've just explained that has trap value, and the property just simply needs someone to come and release the value. Investors who are hoping to buy and sell a property under a short time horizon, or those who are using too much debt, should not follow this investment approach, for the reason being that the markets can take much longer to correct the deviation from price to value. Let me just explain that very briefly. There are some people who practiced the approach of buying and selling. So for example, we use this same property. Mr. A has a time horizon of, say, 10 years. He's willing to hold on to the property that long, and therefore he has a long time horizon. Mr. B, on the other hand, can see the same potential the property has. He intends to buy the property and sell the property, but he only has 2 years to complete the works to buy, renovate, and sell. Mr. A will be more suited. It will be more suitable for him to use this DCF approach. Mr. B should not use the DCF approach, for the reason being he has a shorter time horizon. And the reason I say this is, for example, we'll go back to 2007. This property was on the market, say, and then it was purchased. Let's say in 2007, the property was on the market for slightly more. Let's say it was on the market for £700,000. Obviously, the market was hot. By 2009, we had a market crisis. the property price dropped down to £500,000. Mr. B arrives and says, well, I think this property is worth £750,000. If I spend £100,000, I can make £150,000. So Mr. B buys the property, renovates the property, puts the property back on the market in 2009. And the property prices are still very low. The property does not sell because the market is very pessimistic. So Mr. B is stuck because he has to wait until the market mood rebounds and until there's enough capital in the market. If Mr. B only had 2 years, so he would have had 2009 to 2011 to wait. However, if you were to go and look at the property prices in 2011, they were still at a low position in the market cycle. It wasn't until we got to 2014, 15 that property prices started to elevate again. So Mr. B would have needed at least 4 or 5 years for the market to rebound, for the price of the property after he had converted the property to move up to the value of 750. If Mr. B was forced to sell the property in 2012, maybe the property may have sold for 550,000, which would mean that he would have made a loss because it cost him 600,000, 500 plus 100,000 conversion fee. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why John Maynard Keynes said that the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. So in all of your dealings, always ask yourself the question, what is my time frame? What is my time horizon? The discounted cash flow methodology works for people with a long time horizon. If you have a short time horizon, you should not use the Dcf approach in your analysis, and therefore you should not purchase a property based on this methodology, because the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. The reason John Maynard Keynes said that is this: it is impossible for you to go bankrupt if you do not have any debt. So if Mr. B had purchased this property for 500,000 and he had 100,000 cash, he could have completed the works and he would just wait because he's used his cash. On the other hand, if Mr. B had purchased the property using debt, in this case, let's assume he had borrowed 400,000 and he had bought the property using the debt and £100,000 deposit, and he was going to put £100,000 for converting the property and refurbing the property. If after the first 2 years he hadn't sold the property, then he would have had to, assuming obviously he wasn't looking to rent, he was looking to sell, what that would have meant was that if he sold the property for £550,000 in 2012, the first thing that would have happened would have been he would have had to have paid his debtors. But what if he could not sell the property? And the creditors rather, he would have had to have paid his debts. What would have happened if the creditors had come back to Mr. B and said, we need our money now. We need our money. Then technically, he would have been in a bad place. So, John Maynard Keynes, again, and his advice is that the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. The key thing to keep in mind is this: the way you fund your investment affects your investment strategy. And therefore, that also affects how you value the property. So keep those two things in mind In the next session, I will move from the DCF methodology or the intrinsic valuation approach. I would move to explain the relative pricing approach. I think you'll find the relative pricing approach to be more consistent with what the market does and what most astute investors do in relation to how they buy real estate or how they buy properties.